In the modern world, time is often treated as a ruthless dictator, an arrow moving forward, indifferent to our desires, ambitions, or regrets. It is measured, sliced, and scheduled, reducing human life to a series of deadlines, milestones, and expiry dates. From this perspective, aging becomes a threat rather than a gift, because we assume that meaning diminishes as the clock ticks on. But this is a distortion. It is the illusion of linear time as ultimate, and it blinds us to the deeper dimension of existence. Buddhist wisdom speaks of time not as a line, but as a cycle, something fluid, impermanent, and ultimately empty of inherent identity. Time is not a god, nor is it our enemy. It is a construct, a lens through which we interpret change. And when we cling too tightly to the linear progression of youth, achievement, and productivity, we bind ourselves to suffering. We measure our worth by how early we succeeded, or how late we feel, and in doing so we miss the sacred now. To feel left behind is to compare oneself to a fabricated standard that does not hold up under spiritual scrutiny. The spiritual masters, whether in the Christian desert or in the Buddhist monasteries, often achieved their deepest clarity not in youth but in silence, solitude, and age. The rush to arrive is not the path to wisdom. Rather, the contemplative traditions of both East and West insist that the soul unfolds according to a rhythm far deeper than the ticking of any clock. Linear time fuels anxiety. It whispers that we're running out, that it's too late, that others are ahead and we are behind. But these are judgments rooted in ego, not in truth. Buddhist insight challenges this illusion by inviting us to see the present moment as the only place where awakening occurs. There is no enlightenment in the past or the future, only here, only now, only in the awareness that transcends time altogether. The cultural obsession with being on time reflects a loss of spiritual imagination. We no longer ask if we are becoming more loving, more aware, more free. We ask if we're on track, as though life were a train line. But the spiritual path is not a race, and the soul does not bloom on schedule. What is early or late to the ego may be perfect in the eyes of eternity. This dissonance is what Buddhist wisdom gently but firmly unravels. When we treat time as ultimate, we treat ourselves as products on a shelf, aging into obsolescence. But the self is not a product. It is a process, an unfolding mystery. In Buddhist terms, the self is empty of fixed essence, and in Christian metaphysics, it is seen as a being, becoming. Both traditions point beyond the shallow grip of temporal comparison. They suggest that true selfhood is not subject to time in the way the body is. To unlearn the illusion of linear time is to free the heart from unnecessary burdens. One no longer sees wrinkles as failure, or missed opportunities as cosmic injustice. Instead, every phase of life becomes a chapter in the unfolding of awakening. Wisdom, then, is not the possession of the young or the efficient. It is the fruit of detachment from the tyranny of clocks. The real tragedy is not growing old. It is never growing deep. This illusion persists because we lack stillness, and without stillness, we cannot see beyond the noise of measurement. The spiritual traditions have always insisted that contemplation reveals the truth, that time cannot contain the soul in a culture saturated with images of vitality, speed, and youthfulness. The idea of aging can feel like a slow erasure. But deeper than wrinkles or changing roles lies a subtler trap, the attachment to youth as the core of one's identity. This attachment is not merely a desire for physical beauty or energy. It is the mistaken belief that our worth is rooted in how closely we align with youth's traits: ambition, relevance, desirability. It's not the loss of youth that causes suffering. It's the unwillingness to let go of who we were when we had it. From an early age, we are taught to chase the peak moments of youth, as if they define the totality of human experience. Popular narratives reinforce that life's meaning reaches its summit in one's 20s or 30s, where success is expected, appearance is praised, and possibility seems endless. When identity is constructed around these fleeting characteristics, aging appears as a threat, a slow, cruel theft of self. But this perception arises only when the self is confused with the surface. Buddhist insight, in its radical simplicity, teaches that attachment leads to suffering. And this applies as much to internal constructs as to external objects. When we attach our identity to youth, we imprison ourselves in an idea that is guaranteed to pass. The body will change, the opportunities will shift, the world will turn, and the person who defined themselves by being youthful will eventually feel like a ghost in their own life, chasing a version of themselves that no longer exists. This craving for youth distorts how we see others and how we see ourselves. It fuels envy toward the young and shame in the mirror. It breeds comparison, turning the sacred journey of aging into a competition we are destined to lose. Instead of honoring the deepening of wisdom and presence that often comes with age, we mourn the loss of speed, novelty, or attraction. This sorrow, however, is not natural. It is taught, conditioned, and reinforced by a world that prizes image over essence. To release attachment to youth is not to reject or resent it, but to see it clearly, as a season, not a self. It is to understand that what we loved about being young may have been the freedom, the openness, the sense of becoming, qualities that are not exclusive to youth at all. In fact, those same qualities can reappear with even greater richness when we are no longer frantically trying to preserve appearances or prove our value. When youth is no longer our identity, aging ceases to be a loss and becomes a transition. We begin to discover identities that were hidden under the surface all along, identities rooted in presence, compassion, reflection, and resilience. These are not glamorous in the eyes of the world, but they are deeply radiant in the realm of spirit. Buddhist teaching invites us to inhabit that radiance not by striving, but by letting go. Detaching from youth as identity is not nihilism, it is liberation. It allows us to age without bitterness and to embrace each stage of life as worthy of attention and reverence. Just as the lotus blooms in muddy water, our deepest beauty can emerge not despite age but because of it. The ego resists this because it fears irrelevance, but the soul knows better. The soul is not young or old. It is awake or asleep. This shift in perspective is not automatic. It requires attention, practice, and the courage to confront the false narratives we have inherited. But once we begin to see through the illusion, we no longer grieve what is fading, we celebrate what is arising. And in that quiet celebration, we step into a version of selfhood that is no longer measured by youth, but by depth, grace, and the gentle unfolding of being. Suffering, in the popular imagination, is often framed as a punishment or misfortune, something to be avoided, numbed, or outrun. But within the deeper wells of spiritual wisdom, particularly in Buddhist teaching, suffering is not viewed as a curse but as an invitation. It is a teacher, subtle and uncompromising, that draws us toward truths we might otherwise ignore. The discomfort it brings is not without purpose. It functions like fire, burning away illusions and attachments that obscure the clarity of the soul. We spend so much of our lives attempting to eliminate suffering through distraction, through achievement, through the pursuit of control. But in that evasion, we often miss the sacred function of pain. Buddhist tradition names suffering as dukkha, a central reality of existence, not to glorify it, but to acknowledge it as an inevitable companion on the human journey. To deny suffering is to deny life itself, but to observe suffering with awareness is to begin to understand its hidden instruction. When suffering is no longer resisted but seen, it reveals the fragile architecture of the ego. The ego, with its insistence on comfort, image, and permanence, finds suffering unbearable because it exposes the temporary nature of all things, and yet this very exposure is where transformation begins. We do not change when everything is working. We change when we are brought low enough to ask deeper questions, when the familiar crumbles and the spirit is forced to seek what cannot be lost. In this way, suffering strips us bare. But it is precisely in the stripping that we encounter the deeper self, the part untouched by roles, possessions, or status. The one who suffers consciously discovers the impermanence of external identity, and in doing so, awakens to what lies beneath. This is not the self we project to the world, but the self that remains when the projections fall away. It is not defined by what happens to it, but by how it meets what happens. A culture without a spiritual framework tends to pathologize suffering, seeing it as failure or weakness. But ancient traditions, Buddhist, Christian, and others, have always understood suffering as a space of encounter. It is where the soul wrestles with meaning, where false securities are shattered, and where something deeper is invited to emerge. The pain itself is not divine, but what it opens within us can be. The classroom of suffering teaches not through comfort, but through depth. This is not to romanticize suffering or to seek it. Rather, it is to recognize that when it comes, and it will, it need not be wasted. The pain that shatters the ego can also shatter illusions. The grief that seems unbearable can also uncover tenderness. The disillusionment that leaves us raw can also awaken us to reality, unfiltered and sacred. These are lessons that can only be learned in the dark, when the usual lights no longer guide us. Suffering creates silence within us, not the silence of defeat, but the silence of listening. When suffering silences the ego's noise, something quieter begins to speak. That still, small voice may not offer explanations, but it offers presence. It does not solve, but it sustains. It teaches us how to remain, how to breathe, how to soften rather than resist. This is the kind of wisdom that cannot be taught in textbooks or lectures. It must be felt, endured, lived. Through suffering, we encounter the boundaries of our own strength and the possibility of surrender. Not the surrender of giving up, but the surrender of control, the release of the illusion that we are invincible or in charge. In this humility, compassion grows. We begin to see others not as competitors or strangers, but as fellow travelers in pain. And in that shared space, we find not despair, but communion, and the quiet beginnings of inner transformation. Impermanence, for many, is a source of unease. The idea that everything changes, decays, or eventually disappears strikes at the heart of our desire for stability. We long for permanence, in relationships, in success, in the self we have crafted, and yet it is precisely this longing that keeps us tethered to suffering. Buddhist insight turns this fear on its head by revealing that impermanence is not something to resist, but something to embrace as a path to freedom. The anxiety we carry about time passing, about losing what we hold dear, stems from a deep misunderstanding. We assume that permanence provides security, that if something lasts forever it must be valuable. But permanence is not the source of value, awareness is. It is not the duration of a thing that makes it beautiful, but the clarity with which we behold it. When we acknowledge the impermanence of life, we are freed to be present with it, rather than clinging to what cannot stay. To see impermanence clearly is to recognize that nothing is fixed, not our identities, not our failures, not even our wounds. This recognition can be terrifying to the ego, which thrives on definition and control, but it is liberating to the soul, which thrives on openness and transformation. What we fear losing often prevents us from becoming. We hold on tightly to who we were, and in doing so, we resist who we are meant to be. In every changing season, every falling leaf, every wrinkle that forms on the face, impermanence speaks. It tells us that nothing is stuck. No emotion lasts forever. No state of mind is permanent. No structure in our lives, no matter how solid, is immune to change. This can feel like loss, but it is also grace. If all things are in motion, then no suffering is eternal, no mistake is final, and no story is ever truly over. The spiritual invitation of impermanence is to let go, not of love or joy or commitment, but of the illusion that any of these can be possessed. We do not own the people in our lives. We do not own our youth or our health. We do not even own the moments we cherish. We are stewards, not possessors, and in learning to hold lightly, we experience the joy of something precisely because we know it will pass. Impermanence undermines the ego's constant grasping for control. It reveals that the very nature of life is flux, and that control is a mirage. This is not a cause for despair, it is a reason to soften. It is an opening into surrender, not as weakness, but as a wise alignment with reality. The more we fight change, the more we suffer, but when we turn toward it, even with trembling hands, we begin to taste the freedom of what it means to flow. Freedom through impermanence is not detachment in the cold sense, but engagement without clinging. It is the ability to love fully, knowing that nothing lasts forever, and yet finding that love becomes even more sacred because of its transience. It is living not in fear of endings, but in gratitude for beginnings. This posture of heart is not taught by the world, but it is whispered by the changing sky, the setting sun, the passing moment. In Buddhist practice, meditation on impermanence is not meant to make us feel helpless, but to wake us up. It peels back the illusions we place on life and invites us into a deeper awareness, one that sees clearly, holds gently, and walks humbly within the ever-shifting tides of existence. The middle way, as taught in Buddhist philosophy, offers a path that avoids the extremes of indulgence and denial. When applied to aging, it becomes a lens through which we can view the passage of time with clarity, neither glamorizing youth nor demonizing decline. Our culture, however, rarely honors this balance. It pushes us toward the worship of youth or the despair of aging, both of which are distortions. The middle way invites us to walk through aging not with resistance, but with reverence. On one extreme lies obsession with preservation, a relentless attempt to halt the natural flow of life. This appears in the form of cosmetic alterations, performance, enhancing regimens, and a desperate need to remain relevant in a youth-driven world. Beneath this pursuit is fear, the fear of becoming invisible, of losing control, of no longer mattering. But this fear is fed by illusion. The illusion that value is tied to appearance or productivity imprisons the soul in shallow waters. On the opposite extreme is resignation, the belief that aging equals decay, irrelevance, and withdrawal. In this mindset, people retreat from life, convinced that their best years are behind them. They stop learning, stop connecting, and begin to shrink from the world. This too is a falsehood. It reduces the richness of aging to a slow disappearance, rather than recognizing it as a deepening, a season marked not by decline, but by a different kind of fruitfulness. The middle way between these poles is a path of conscious acceptance. It is the refusal to disguise age or deny it, and equally the refusal to collapse under it. It means aging with awareness, recognizing what is lost without bitterness and what is gained without arrogance. It is not passive, but reflective. It asks us not to cling to former selves, but to inhabit who we are now with dignity and grace. Walking this path means making peace with limits. The body changes, energy shifts, roles evolve, but none of this negates meaning. In fact, it invites a new kind of engagement with life, one that is slower, more intentional, and often more profound. The middle way does not romanticize aging, but it honors it. It sees beauty not in perfection, but in authenticity, in the lines of the face, the weight of memory, the gentleness forged by experience. Culturally, we are rarely taught how to age wisely. We are given tools to succeed, but not to surrender. The middle way offers a counter-narrative, one in which surrender is not defeat but discernment. It teaches that aging is not about holding on, nor about giving up, but about letting be, letting the moment be enough, letting the body speak its truth, letting the heart remain open, even as it learns to say goodbye. This balanced approach also transforms how we see others. It softens judgment and awakens compassion. We no longer envy the young or pity the old. We recognize the sacredness of every stage. The The middle way dissolves the competition of timelines and invites community across generations. It allows us to receive wisdom from those ahead and to share insight with those behind without superiority or shame. To age without extremes is to age as a pilgrim, not as a performer. The pilgrim accepts the journey with its weathered terrain and its shifting light. The goal is not to arrive unchanged, but to arrive truer. Aging, then, becomes a spiritual path, not a cosmetic dilemma or a social tragedy, but a quiet unfolding marked by depth, simplicity, and inward expansion in a society obsessed with early achievement and youthful brilliance. There is an unspoken narrative that awakening, or personal transformation, must happen early to be meaningful. We celebrate the prodigy, the young innovator, the early success story, and in doing so, we quietly dismiss the sacred unfolding that happens later in life. But spiritual traditions, especially Buddhism, gently dismantle this illusion. Awakening is not tethered to age, it is not a race. It is a realization that arrives when the heart is ready, not when the world expects it. There are seasons of the soul that do not align with the calendar. Some awaken in youth, shaken by suffering or wonder. Others wander for decades before clarity begins to dawn. What matters is not the timing, but the depth of the encounter. In Buddhist terms, awakening is the recognition of one's true nature beyond ego, beyond delusion. That recognition can take a lifetime of shedding illusions to finally glimpse what was always present. Often it is age, with its slower rhythm and accumulated loss, that makes awakening more likely. The noise of ambition fades, the urgency to prove oneself begins to dissolve. What once seemed important, status, appearance, control, starts to fall away, and in the quiet that remains, something deeper is heard. The aging heart becomes less distracted and more attentive. The eyes no longer look outward for validation, but inward for truth. There is a kind of wisdom that can only be born through time. The young may possess energy and vision, but the elder often holds stillness and perspective. It is in the long observing of life, its cycles, its disappointments, its mystery, that one becomes ready to awaken not as an idea, but as a lived reality. This awakening is not flashy or loud. It does not require applause. It is a steady returning to what is real. To believe that it is too late to wake up is to misunderstand the nature of awakening itself. It is not the reward of the gifted or the disciplined alone. It is the birthright of every being, and it arrives not according to age, but according to readiness. The crack in the illusion can open through grief, through silence, through illness, or through the smallest moment of clarity. It is not bound by the body's strength or the mind's sharpness. There are those who live decades asleep, functioning, successful, admired, yet unaware of the deeper stream flowing beneath all things. And there are those who, in the last chapters of life, finally taste the freedom that comes from letting go. In that letting go, something ancient awakens, the awareness that one is not the sum of accomplishments or regrets, but a being rooted in something far more expansive than time. To age, then, is not to move away from awakening, but to move toward the conditions that make it more possible. The slowing down, the shedding of unnecessary striving, the confrontation with mortality, all these clear the ground for awakening to take root. It is often in the latter half of life that the ego finally loosens its grip, and the soul begins to breathe more freely. When we stop treating awakening as something earned by youth or accelerated by urgency, we begin to honor the slow miracle of becoming conscious. We see that the deepest truths do not shout, they wait. And they often wait until we are quiet enough, empty enough, and humble enough to finally receive them.